With over 5,000 aerial victories to its name, the F6F Hellcat was, by sheer kill count, the most lethal fighter of the entire Second World War. But despite that jaw-dropping number, it's rarely the first aircraft people mention when talking about legendary wartime fighters. Nevertheless, we're going to tell you a turbulent story of the fighter that reportedly shot down 19 enemy aircraft for every one it lost, how it achieved that, and why it got the nickname the Ace Maker. To understand the Hellcat's story, you first need to look at the kind of war it was built for. The Pacific Theater introduced a completely new type of combat, where carrier-based warfare was now on a scale the world had never seen. The goal wasn't just controlling waters with huge battleships, but also the skies above the ocean, because in this new war, whoever had air supremacy effectively ruled the ocean, and with that, everything else. After Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States and Japan began clashing across the Pacific, and naval dominance now depended heavily on aircraft carriers. These massive floating airstrips could launch waves of fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes at sea or land targets anywhere in reach. They were the core of fleet operations, and air superiority became the deciding factor. But there was a catch. This strategy relied entirely on the performance of the aircraft those carriers launched. And right at the start of the war, the United States had a serious problem, the Mitsubishi A6M0. When the fighting kicked off, American carriers were still fielding the F4F Wildcat. It was already nearing the end of its design life, and the Navy was actively searching for a better replacement. That urgency turned into crisis when Wildcats began facing off against Japanese Zeros, where in head-to-head dogfights, the Wildcat was simply outclassed. The Zero was faster, more agile, and flown by elite Japanese pilots with huge combat experience. American squadrons started suffering heavy losses, and there wasn't time for slow, step-by-step improvements. The Navy needed something significantly better, and they needed it fast. That's where Grumman, the company already producing the Wildcat, came in. But this time, they went back to square one to build an entirely new aircraft from the ground up. In fact, early work on the project that would become the F6F Hellcat had already started before America officially entered the war. It was now panically hurried, but something strange would happen that would bring the future Hellcat exactly what it needed to defeat the Japanese Zero after a stroke of luck, or misfortune, depending on which side you were on. In 1942, a Japanese Zero crash-landed in the Aleutian Islands and was captured mostly intact as it hit the soft ground. That was just a gold mine of information. US engineers and test pilots took it apart, studied every inch, and then flew it in mock dogfights against their own planes. It revealed exactly how the Zero operated, and more importantly, how to beat it. Grumman went back to their drawing board and began adjusting the Hellcat specifically to counter everything the Zero could do. And this was about to change the air war in the Pacific. However, not everything would go so smoothly. The Japanese Zero was insanely agile for its time. In a turning fight, it could outmaneuver just about anything the Allies had in the air. It was light, had a long range, and could pull off tight moves with ease. But all of that came with a price. The Zero sacrificed almost everything else. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and a fragile frame. Its top weapon and protection was speed and agility, but just a single well-placed shot could end its life. So Grumman approached the problem differently. Instead of trying to match the Zero's strengths, they set out to build something that would exploit its weaknesses. And, well, considering how many Zeros went down in dogfights against Hellcats, they clearly got the formula right. What they rolled out was the F6F prototype. It had a larger frame, a raised cockpit for better visibility, and several design features tailor-made for carrier operations. That included features like wide-set hydraulically powered landing gear and folding wings to save space on tightly packed flight decks. Just to compare, the earlier Wildcats required pilots to manually crank the landing gear up by hand after takeoff, which was a risky and exhausting task to do while you're climbing and vulnerable. Through some back-and-forth modifications and pilot feedback, the Hellcat was combat-ready in just 10 months. In just 2 years, more than 12,000 Hellcats would roll out of the factories in record time. Unlike the Zero, the Hellcat was built to take punishment. It was more than twice as heavy, with a max takeoff weight of about 15,000 pounds. It had self-sealing fuel tanks, reinforced structure, and more than 200 pounds of armor around the cockpit and engine, while the front windscreen could stop machine gun fire. All of that meant a Hellcat could take brutal damage and still make it back to the carrier. In fact, there are documented cases where they returned with over 200 bullet holes, or with part of its wing completely gone. That said, early models still couldn't quite keep up with the Zero in terms of speed, at least not until they installed the real game changer. The Hellcat was soon fitted with a supercharged 18-cylinder double Wasp radial engine, putting out more than 2,000 horsepower, combined with a massive 13-foot three-bladed propeller that gave it a top speed of over 390 miles per hour in level flight. The Hellcat's standard armament was 6 50-cal machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, and with 400 rounds per gun. Later versions even stepped up the firepower by adding a pair of 20mm cannons alongside 4 of the original 50-caliber guns. Beyond guns, the Hellcat had hardpoints under both wings and the fuselage. It could carry 500 or even 1,000-pound bombs, unguided rockets, and torpedoes. Altogether, it was capable of hauling up to 4,000 pounds of external ordnance. So while it was built as a fighter, the Hellcat could easily switch roles to serve in ground attack or close support missions. But as a fighter, it carved out a reputation as arguably the deadliest fighter aircraft of World War II. Its first taste of combat came on August 31st, 1943, during a Navy carrier raid on Marcus Island, deep in the Central Pacific. Hellcats launched from the USS Independence and soon claimed their first victory, downing a Japanese Kawanishi Emily flying boat. Soon after, the Hellcat was facing much fiercer opposition. In October 1943, it joined the US raid on Wake Island, and that's where it got its first serious test. During the fighting, Hellcats shot down 18 Japanese planes while losing just 2 of their own. But the real turning point came during operations over the Gilbert and Marshall Islands later that year. One key battle took place above Tarawa, where nearly 50 Japanese Zeros engaged a smaller American force flying Hellcats. The outcome? 30 enemy fighters shot down. Only 1 Hellcat was lost. Even though the Zero still had the edge in low-speed maneuvering and tight turns, American pilots knew better than to play to its strengths. They were trained to avoid turning dogfights. Instead, they used what are called boom and zoom tactics. The idea was to climb high, dive fast, take a shot, then pull up and climb out before the enemy could pursue. The Zero couldn't follow those high-speed dives because its paper structure airframe just wasn't built to handle that kind of G-forces, and that gave the Hellcat a huge tactical advantage. However, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was a full-scale showdown between American and Japanese fleets, and the Hellcat played a major role. Thanks to radar guidance, US ships could detect incoming Japanese formations long before they got close. That gave Hellcat squadrons enough time to climb and prepare to intercept, setting the stage for a devastating air battle. What followed would go down in history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In just 2 days, American pilots destroyed more than 300 Japanese aircraft, most of them shot down by Hellcats, while the US lost just 29 planes in return. However, what really shattered Japanese air power in this battle was actually the loss of experienced pilots. Japan simply couldn't replace them fast enough, and that loss of veteran air crews was a blow they'd never recover from. The tide of the Pacific War had officially turned, and the Hellcat was right at the center of it. Now, that famous 19-to-1 kill ratio sounds almost unbelievable, and it kind of is. So let's break it down a bit. On paper, Hellcat pilots claimed 5,163 aerial kills, while losing just 270 of their own in air-to-air combat. But like with most wartime numbers, especially from the air war, those figures need some context. Japanese combat records were largely destroyed after the war ended, which makes it hard to confirm many of the kill claims. And post-war analysis shows that American pilots, like every air force in World War II, likely overclaimed, possibly by as much as 25%. Still, even with a generous correction for overclaims, the Hellcat's record is outstanding. If you bring the numbers down to a more conservative level, you're still looking at a kill ratio of about 13 or 14 to 1. That's higher than any other fighter in the entire war by a wide margin. But what really makes that ratio so impressive is that it was achieved by young, usually newer pilots, many of whom had rushed through shortened Navy training programs. They were mostly new recruits and often fresh out of flight school, and yet the Hellcat's design made that possible. It was stable, forgiving, and easy to handle even in combat, which gave these green pilots a real chance to survive their first missions and start racking up victories. Some even became aces in a matter of minutes. That meant having more than 5 aerial victories, and yes, someone managed that in just minutes. That's why the F6F earned the nickname Ace Maker. It produced more aces than any other Allied plane in the war. Over 300 Hellcat pilots reached that mark. Meanwhile, things were falling apart on the Japanese side. After suffering devastating losses, they began relying more and more on kamikaze tactics. Their remaining fighters were outdated and often in poor condition, and the pilots flying them were often barely trained. Combine that with the Allies' growing radar capabilities and sheer numerical superiority, and Japan's chances of turning the air war around had vanished. Even as the conflict dragged on into its final year, the Hellcat remained a reliable workhorse. It was still dogfighting when needed, but also escorting bombers, attacking ships, and supporting troops on the ground. But with jet aircraft now entering the picture, the age of piston-engine fighters was winding down. The Hellcat's official replacement was the F6F Bearcat, a faster, more powerful evolution of the same basic idea, but it arrived just a little too late to see combat. The future of fighter aviation had shifted to jets, like the F/H Phantom and the F/9F Panther, ushering in a new chapter of air warfare. If you like our short documentary videos, you can subscribe for more. We have a lot of new things coming up.